There is a moment that happens for some men. It's not dramatic. There's no breakdown, no explosion, no single event you could point to and say, that's where it started. It's quieter than that. It's a Tuesday afternoon or a Sunday morning, and something just shifts. A thought forms that wasn't there before, or maybe it was always there, somewhere underneath, and now it's finally risen to the surface where it can be seen clearly. And the thought is simple. What if I just stopped? Not stopped living, not stopped building, not stopped growing, stopped chasing, stopped performing, stopped measuring my value by whether or not someone chose me. For most men, that thought gets pushed back down immediately because everything around them, culture, family, media, friends, tells them that thought is dangerous, that it means something is wrong with them, that men who think that way are broken or bitter or afraid. But for a growing number of men across the world, that thought doesn't get pushed back down. It gets examined, and the more it gets examined, the more it starts to make a different kind of sense. This is not a story about hatred. It's not a story about bitterness or failure or giving up on life. It's a story about a calculation, a conclusion, a deliberate decision made by men who looked at the system they were operating inside, weighed the costs and rewards honestly, and decided the equation no longer worked in their favor. It's the story of why some men choose the MGTOW path. And if you want to understand it, really understand it, not just dismiss it, then stay with this, because what's actually happening here is far more complex and far more human than most people want to admit. Let's start with something that most conversations about this topic skip entirely. The men who arrive at this decision are not, for the most part, men who never tried. They're men who tried a lot. They pursued relationships with genuine effort and genuine feeling. They invested emotionally. They showed up, they communicated, they did the work that every book, every therapist, every well-meaning person told them to do, and many of them were still met with confusion, instability, disappointment, or simply outcomes that didn't reflect the investment now. That experience alone doesn't explain everything. Relationships are complicated. People get hurt on all sides. Nobody has a perfect record in love. But here is what's different about how many of these men processed that experience. They didn't just feel pain, they looked for the pattern. Because men, and this is not a stereotype, it's an observed tendency, men are deeply oriented towards systems, rules, logic, cause, and effect. When something doesn't work, the instinct is often find the flaw in the system, correct it, try again. So that's what many of them did. They read, they studied, they talked to other men, they looked at data, divorce rates, legal structures, social dynamics, the changing landscape of modern relationships, and gradually a picture formed, not a picture of women as enemies, not a picture of relationships as inherently corrupt, a picture of a system that, from their vantage point, was structurally misaligned with their interests. And once a man sees that picture, once it becomes clear to him through logic and evidence rather than just emotion, it's very difficult to unsee. Here is where the evolutionary framing matters, and it matters more than people give it credit for. At a fundamental biological level, every organism, human beings included, is running a constant background calculation. Maybe it's not conscious, maybe you never put it into words, but it's always happening. The calculation is, does the cost of this action justify the potential return? For men throughout most of human history, the answer to that question in the context of long-term partnership was yes, clearly, definitively. You invest effort, resources, loyalty, protection. In return, you receive stability, partnership, family, a shared life built over decades. The exchange is clear. The roles are defined. The risk, while always present, is manageable and relatively predictable. That calculation has shifted. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but for enough men, in enough contexts, that the shift is measurable and real. Legal frameworks in many countries have made the structural consequences of relationship dissolution significantly more costly for men. Social norms have changed in ways that, in many cases, have removed incentives that previously existed. The culture around commitment has become more ambiguous. The expectations around long-term partnership less defined. What this means, from a purely strategic standpoint, is that the risk profile of deep relational investment has changed. And when the risk profile changes, behavior changes. That's not cynicism, that's not misogyny, that's not emotional immaturity. That's how human beings, and especially men, respond to changing environmental conditions. But let's be precise about something, because this is where most of the misunderstanding lives. The decision to step away from the conventional relationship structure doesn't happen in a single moment of logic. It builds. Think about the progression. Early on, there's still hope. There's belief that the right approach, the right attitude, the right version of yourself will produce the outcomes you want. So you keep adjusting. You keep trying different things. You invest more, or you try to invest differently. You work on yourself. You attempt to solve the equation by improving the input. And then, somewhere along the way, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I improve my approach to this system? It becomes, is this system worth approaching at all? That's the threshold. And once a man crosses it, the direction of his thinking reverses completely. Before that threshold, all his effort goes into optimization. Better himself. Better his approach. Get better results inside the system. After that threshold, all his effort goes into something else. Build himself. Develop himself. Create a life that doesn't require validation from anyone outside himself. And here is the part that most observers miss when they look at men who've made this shift. They don't look defeated, they look lighter. There is often a genuine sense of relief that comes after a man makes this decision. Not the hollow relief of avoidance, the quiet, stable relief of someone who has stopped fighting a war they decided wasn't worth fighting. Let's talk about the rules, because there are patterns here that repeat across thousands of individual stories. And once you see them, they're unmistakable. The first one is this. When outcomes become consistently uncertain, investment drops. This is not specific to relationships. It applies to everything. Business, careers, friendships, creative, work. Human beings invest where they believe investment has a reasonable probability of generating return. When that probability becomes unclear, when the connection between effort and outcome becomes too loose, too unpredictable, too dependent on factors outside your control, the natural response is to pull back. In the context of modern relationships, many men report exactly this experience, that the connection between genuine effort, showing up, being present, being honest, building stability, and positive relational outcomes has become less reliable, more variable, more dependent on forces that feel outside their influence. And when that happens, investment drops. Not because the man stops caring about connection, but because the rational mind, looking at repeated patterns, begins to protect against the cost of continued uncertainty. The second rule is simpler and cuts even deeper. When the environment feels unstable, independence becomes the most attractive form of stability. Think about what independence offers someone who has spent years navigating uncertain systems: control, predictability, the knowledge that your outcomes are determined primarily by your own actions, the ability to build without the constant risk of having what you've built disrupted by factors outside your control. For many men who choose this path, independence isn't a consolation prize. It's not second place. It's a genuinely preferred state. A life structured entirely around personal development, physical, financial, intellectual, creative, with no external accountability pulling in directions that feel misaligned with their own goals. Once that mindset takes hold, it reinforces itself rapidly. Because independence, when you're building intentionally, produces results. Those results create confidence. That confidence reduces the emotional pull towards seeking external validation, which reinforces the sense that independence was the right call. It becomes a self-sustaining system, and that system, for many of these men, feels more stable than anything they encountered inside conventional relationship structures. The third rule is about emotional architecture. Detachment, real, cultivated, practiced emotional detachment, creates a kind of internal stability that engagement rarely does. This sounds cold when you first hear it, but hear it all the way through. The men who adopt this principle are not trying to feel nothing. They're not trying to hollow themselves out or become robotic. They're trying to stop allowing external variables, other people's moods, behaviors, decisions, reactions, to have direct, unmediated access to their emotional state. Think of it like this. If your emotional baseline rises and falls entirely based on how someone else is treating you on any given day, you have no stable ground. You are constantly reactive, constantly reorienting, constantly managing the internal turbulence generated by an External world you can't control. Detachment in this context means building a ground that doesn't shift with every external wave. It means developing an internal relationship with yourself that is primary, that exists independent of whether anyone else sees you, chooses you, validates you, or stays. And from that ground, from that stable internal base, you can still feel things, still connect in the ways and contexts you choose. But you're not at the mercy of those connections in the way you were before. Now let's look at the behavioral contrast, because it's visible and it's instructive. Watch a man before this shift happens. He initiates, he pursues, he adjusts his behavior based on signals from the person he's pursuing. He tries to read what's wanted and provide it. He modifies himself, sometimes subtly, sometimes significantly, in response to perceived expectations. He invests his emotional energy heavily in the outcome of relational dynamics. He is, fundamentally, oriented outward. His self-assessment is partially constructed through the eyes of others. Now watch a man after the shift. He's still present, still intelligent, still capable of deep engagement, but the orientation is different. It's inward first, outward second. He doesn't adjust himself for approval. He's not reading signals and recalibrating his behavior to produce a specific reaction. His emotional energy goes primarily into his own projects, his own development, his own direction. And here's what's interesting about this shift from a purely interpersonal dynamic standpoint. The man who invests less, who is clearly not invested in a particular outcome, often carries a very different kind of presence than the man who is openly, visibly invested. There's something about genuine non-investment that communicates a kind of self-sufficiency. A signal that says, I don't need this to go any particular way because my life is already what I want it to be. That signal, regardless of your views on the MGTOW philosophy itself, is real. And it tends to produce very different interpersonal dynamics than constant pursuit and approval seeking ever did. Why is this path growing? Because information spreads, and shared experience creates clarity. 20 years ago, a man who reached this conclusion was largely alone with it. Maybe he talked to one or two friends. Maybe he just quietly changed his behavior without any framework or language for what he was doing. Today, those men are talking to each other at scale. Online communities, podcasts, forums, videos, an entire ecosystem has developed where men share observations, experiences, data, perspectives, where the patterns one man noticed get compared to the patterns another man noticed, and a coherent picture emerges. And when enough men see the same picture independently, and then find each other and confirm what they each saw separately, the conclusion becomes harder to dismiss as individual pathology. It starts to look like what it actually might be. A rational response to a specific set of structural conditions. Now, and this is important, not everyone inside this movement has arrived at the same destination. There are men here who are genuinely at peace, who have built rich, meaningful, productive lives, who have no hostility toward anyone, who simply made a quiet decision about how they want to live and got on with living it. And there are men here who are still in the angry phase, who arrived through pain and haven't yet moved through it, who are using the philosophy as a container for unprocessed bitterness rather than as a genuine architecture for a better life. Those are different things, and it's important to tell them apart, because the former is a legitimate life philosophy. The latter is a wound wearing the clothes of a philosophy. The path itself doesn't require the bitterness. In fact, the clearest thinkers inside this framework will tell you the bitterness is a sign you're still attached to the outcome you said you no longer wanted. Real detachment doesn't burn, it releases. What most people get wrong about this is that they collapse the category too quickly. They hear men who step back from relationships and immediately load it with familiar, comfortable narratives. He's afraid of commitment, he's immature, he couldn't make it work, so he's invented a philosophy to justify his failure. Those narratives are not only often inaccurate, they're intellectually lazy. They're a way of not engaging with the actual argument, of dismissing the conclusion by pathologizing the person who reached it, rather than examining the reasoning itself. The more honest question is, given the specific conditions these men are navigating, legal, cultural, psychological, structural, is their conclusion unreasonable? You can disagree with their answer. You can think they're wrong about the conditions. You can think the costs of This path outweighed the benefits in ways they're not fully accounting for. Those are legitimate counter-arguments, but he must be damaged is not a counter-argument. It's an evasion, and the men who have made this decision clearly and logically, who can articulate the reasoning, who are living well inside it, who are not angry or bitter, but simply oriented differently, those men deserve an actual engagement with their actual position. There is one more distinction that matters, and it may be the most important one: the difference between avoidance and alignment. Avoidance looks like this: stepping back from relationships because the idea of intimacy, vulnerability, or potential rejection is too threatening. Running away from something because it feels dangerous. Building walls because you don't trust your own ability to survive impact. That is fear-based, and fear-based decisions, however rational they appear on the surface, are fundamentally reactive. They're still defined by the thing they're running from. Alignment looks different. Alignment is when you've genuinely examined what you want your life to be, not what culture tells you it should be, not what your parents wanted for you, not what you thought you were supposed to want, and you've made a decision based on that examination. When a man chooses this path from alignment rather than avoidance, his life looks genuinely different. He's not checking over his shoulder. He's not performing indifference. He's not secretly hoping someone will change his mind. He has a direction and he's moving in it, fully, with clarity and without apology. And that, whatever you think of the philosophy itself, is a form of freedom that most people, men or women, never actually find. Most people live lives constructed around the expectations of others, around inherited narratives about what a good life is supposed to look like, around fear of judgment, around the constant management of how they're perceived. The man who has reached genuine alignment, who has done the internal work to know what he actually values and built his life accordingly, has stepped outside all of that. He is no longer waiting for external permission to live the way he wants to live. He stopped asking the system to validate him, and he built his own. So when you see a man who has stepped away from the conventional path, who is not pursuing, not competing for attention, not performing his value for anyone, resist the immediate impulse to assume you know what that means, because it might not mean what you think. It might not be failure dressed up in philosophy. It might not be bitterness calling itself peace. It might be a man who did the math, who looked at what was being asked of him, weighed it honestly against what was being offered in return, and made a clear-headed decision about how to allocate the one resource he can never get back: his time, his energy, his life. And he decided, this is how I want to spend it, not in pursuit of someone else's approval, not inside a system that doesn't serve me, not waiting for a validation that may never come, not measuring my worth by whether or not I was chosen, but building something that's entirely mine, that no one can take away, that grows regardless of what anyone else decides. That is the decision some men are making. Whether you agree with it or not, whether it sounds like wisdom or withdrawal, the decision is real, it's deliberate, and it is changing how an entire generation of men moves through the world. The question isn't whether this path is right for everyone. It isn't, and no serious person inside the movement claims it is. The question is whether you're willing to understand it on its own terms, to see it as something more than a symptom and more than a rejection, to recognize that at the center of it, underneath the philosophy, underneath the frameworks, underneath all the rules and principles, there is a man who looked at his own life and decided to live it differently. That choice, whatever you think of the direction it points, is one of the most human things there is.